So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan, Saltwater Junkie here again. And in this video, I'm actually going to be setting up a Rodi system. I'm going to use that system to fill up my 20-gallon auto top-off for my 125-gallon REEF and my 29-gallon auto top-off for my 4 main displays, all running off one sump filtration behind the wall. So truth be told, guys, I have been running both of my systems off of conditioned tap water for quite some time now. And the reason for that is, between my two systems, they do go through about 15 to 20 gallons a week in water, and I just got sick and tired of going to the store every week. Now, I have been fighting this algae bloom in my reef tank, and I'm hoping that's going to start dissipating the more and more Rodi water gets entered into this system. So the system I purchased was a fountainhead water system, a 6-stage Rodi. I got it off of Amazon for right under $200. I didn't run this system very long before realizing I'd like to add a second RO membrane. I ended up adding an extra carbon block and a booster pump, along with a TDS meter, a couple pressure gauges, and some miscellaneous fittings and floats for my auto top-off tanks. I'll be showing you a diagram of how these systems work, the install of how I ran my system, along with the reason for the extra pressure gauges and the booster pump. So this is a really long video, guys, because I was packing so much information into it. However, if you only need to see a certain thing, this is a chapter breakdown of what I've got going on in this video, so you can fast forward through what you don't need to see. So if you enjoy this video and it gives you some good information, please make sure you hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible, so I don't waste your time. So let's get to it. So my fish room, where I mounted this Rodi system, is a storage closet right to the side of the laundry room. So I was able to use this Y garden hose adapter and teed off of the cold water supply to my washing machine for the supply water to the Rodi. So I shut the valve off for the cold water supply, ended up making a big mess of water from the residual pressure that was in the hose going to the washing machine. I added a 45 to the shutoff valve in the wall and then put my Y valve on to make it easier for me to turn on and off the supply to my RO unit. Because I only turn this on once a week and then shut it back off, and I'll explain why that is later in this video. I used a brass fitting that was female garden thread to female pipe thread to put on the Y, and then I used a male pipe thread PEX fitting to 1/4-inch RO tubing. So right here, I'm just using an extra long 3/8 drill bit to go through the drywall from the laundry room to my fish room. I did have to go about 1 inch away from the wall because I did not want to hit the stud that was in the corner. I used my density stud finder to find out how close I could drill it to that wall. I ran that 1/4-inch OD PEX tubing through the wall, then using some plastic tubing clips, I held it tight against the wall above the baseboard. Now, I could have ran my discharge wastewater line right back through the drain of the washer as well. However, once I realized that I was getting 2 gallons of waste for every 1 gallon of treated water, I decided to run that wastewater line out through my garage and out to the front yard to water some plants. So I ended up going up into my attic and making sure there was no plumbing or wiring in the area where I wanted to drill a hole to run that wastewater line and the water supply to my other auto top-off. Then I went back down into my fish room and drilled the hole from the bottom going up, so I knew it was exactly where I wanted the hole to be. After that, I ran the RO line, that's the wastewater, through my garage, and I ran another RO line for the supply to my other auto top-off to the other side of the house through the attic. I used those same plastic clips to hold the water line away from any sharp edges, nails, etc. in the attic. This is my supply line to my other multiple systems, all running off one sump. And that is the auto top-off for it. Here's the 2 lines coming down into the fish room and going down to my other auto top-off and off of the final membrane as the waste. And the wastewater line I ran through my garage all the way out towards the front and down and out the bottom of the garage door. I haven't figured out how I'm going to permanently cross the sidewalk going to my front door, so right now it's just coiled up and I pull it out once a week and water one of my plants that way. So before modifying this system, I did just hook everything up and run it And while I was filling my 20-gallon auto top-off, I went through about 20 gallons in 5-gallon buckets of wastewater, and I had only produced about 8 to 10 gallons of good water in my auto top-off. So then I ended up getting a pressure gauge, and I hooked it to my water supply running to my Rodi. As you can see right here, I'm barely getting above 40 psi, and the recommended pressure is 60 psi for one of these systems. After seeing that low pressure, I double checked and put it on the garden hose attachment right where my main water supply goes into the house, just to double check that I didn't have a pressure loss going to the washing machine for some reason. At that point, that's when I decided to go ahead and buy a booster pump. So the booster pump I got had fittings that you actually thread into the pump, because I've had problems with PEX fittings leaking before, and I didn't want to have to replace a pump because of a leaky fitting. So this way, if I do get a leak right at the pump, I can just replace that PEX fitting instead of the entire pump. So originally when I added this pump, I put it after the carbon filters before the RO membrane, because the RO membrane is the only one that needs the high pressure. So I figured, why run the rest of the system with that high pressure? However, the pump would start cavitating because there would not be enough supply water getting to it after it had gone through the filters. And at that point, I ended up putting it at the beginning of the system, and I have not had a problem since. Most pumps come with a pressure switch built into the pump that you can adjust. I ended up putting mine at 80 psi. You will also need to put a check valve to hold the pressure in the pump so that when the pressure switch shuts off, it doesn't bleed back the pressure and turn it immediately back on. The check valve should be on the water supply side of the pump with the arrow pointing towards the pump. Before spending the money on an actual RO pump, I had this little utility pump that I tried, but it was cycling on and off way too much even after I tried to put a check valve with it, and it was a lot noisier than the RO pump as well. At one point, I even put one of the RO storage tanks that I had to see if that would hold a higher volume of water and not cycle as much, but it all was a big waste of time, and then I ended up having to buy that RO booster pump anyways, which was a lot quieter when running and did not cycle on and off nearly as often as the first pump that I tried. So right here, I'm going to show you guys the actual plumbing that I did for my full system after I got it all figured out. So I'm going to turn the water on right here at my washing machine through that Y valve. As I showed you how I ran that along the baseboard, through the wall, up over the door, over to this T, and I have my pressure gauge for the supply water pressure going to the Rodi. Then it comes down through a shutoff valve that I put in there just in case I need to shut the system down quickly, through my TDS in meter, through my check valve, and into the pump. Coming out of the pump, it goes into my sediment filter, out of the sediment filter through this black line that goes up and around to my carbon block filters, also through another pressure gauge. Now the reason I put this pressure gauge here is these gauges should both read the same. If my second gauge reads lower than my first gauge, I know my sediment filter is getting clogged. So we're going to go through the carbon block filters now. Now I've got this labeled 2 because it is the second part of my system, but this is carbon block 1, carbon block 2, and then carbon block 3, which is my 0.5 micron that I added to the system. We're coming out of the carbon block up to another T, which has another pressure gauge. Now, the reason I added this pressure gauge is because I was trying to just use my booster pump after the carbon filters before the membrane, and that just didn't work out. So in all actuality, this third pressure gauge is not necessary. Since it's already plumbed in, I just decided to leave it there. Through the flow valve, out of the flow valve, and into membrane number 1, which is the 5th stage of my system. The good water coming out of the center is going to come up and loop around and go through this Y valve, through the check valve, through the flow valve again, and down to my DI resin cartridges. Then the wastewater line coming out of the first membrane on this blue line is going around to the inlet on the second RO membrane. The good water coming out of the center of that membrane is going up to that same Y that I have, and then through the check valve, flow valve, and to the DI resins. The wastewater coming out of the second membrane is going through my flush valve and out to my wastewater line going to the front yard. Now the good water coming out of the flow valve from the membranes goes down through my DI resin 1 and 2, out of my DI resin, through my TDS out sensor, and then down through a T that runs to my other auto top off in the other room, through a shutoff valve, and through my float valve for this auto top off. Now the reason for this extra ball valve down here is if I need to, for whatever reason, force the water to fill my other auto top off across the house first, I shut that ball valve off, and therefore it will force the water to that other auto top off before this one. Otherwise, it's going to take the path of least resistance, and it will always fill this auto top off first. So I'm going to turn the booster pump on so you can hear how quiet it is, plus see how quickly it builds the pressure. If you haven't seen my build on this power strip that I made, this makes maintenance on my system way easier by being able to individually shut off a pump or whatever by the flick of a switch instead of having to chase down which cord to unplug from a power strip or wall. And I will post a clip at the end of this video, so if you want to check that out. When installing your cartridges, it's a good idea to check the orientation of your filters. My sediment filter did not matter which way you put it on direction. However, my carbon block filters did look different top to bottom, as you can see here. And mine, the sealing ring went towards the top. So it's a good idea to look at your instructions when you get your filters to check orientation when installing. Another thing that I wasn't quite sure of when starting this project is whether these cartridges were specific to the brand of Rodi system you buy. However, they are pretty universal, so you don't have to buy a specific brand filter. They do all interchange for the most part, and that is helpful because there are a lot of aftermarket filters that are a lot cheaper than some of the name brands. So I told you how I'm going to keep an eye on my sediment filter. We'll see how that goes. As far as the carbon blocks, I figure once a year I'll probably change those out. And then the DI resin filters, they say you know when you need to change them by the discoloration of the cartridge. Right here you can see that it's going from a black to a brown color. And they say when that brown is all the way to the top, that is when it needs changed. Now the interesting thing about this is both of these DI resin cartridges are turning brown at the same height right now. So it'll be interesting to see how that transpires, and I will do an update video whenever I have to change these filters to let you know how it went. So now I'm just going to go over some helpful tips that I learned during the installation process of this unit. As far as pushing the tubes into the quick disconnects, you just need to make sure you give them a nice, hard, firm push to make sure they're seated all the way. As far as getting them off, it can be a little trickier. Now they do make a tool for this, but I just use a 1/4-inch wrench, works just as good. And what you want to do is push the tube into the fitting a little bit, then hold pressure on that fitting with the 1/4-inch wrench, and then pull the tubing out. Now you can order this tool on Amazon, and they're not that much money, but why do it when a 1/4-inch wrench works just as good? Another helpful tip, guys, is as far as cutting this tubing, I don't really like using a pair of dikes because it can kind of pinch the tubing as you cut it, which can make it a little bit more difficult to get that tubing started in the quick disconnect fittings. So they do make a tool for that, and it's not that much money either, or in my case I just used this pair of cable loppers, which gave me a lot cleaner cut than a pair of dikes. So one of the most necessary things that I think is needed to add to your system to make sure it is working properly is a TDS probe. This tells you the total dissolved solids in and out of the system. These sensors have to be timed correctly in order to get a proper reading because the water has to travel between the two probes, not across them, in order to get that accurate reading. You can push it down in place and get it close to being all the way bottomed out, and then look down the center of it, make sure it's timed correctly, and then push it in the rest of the way. So one thing I didn't realize before installing my pressure gauges is that there is a rubber seal that goes in the fittings to seal them. So I actually didn't need to put pipe tape on these pressure gauges, but I left it on there just because I'd already done it and it's not going to hurt anything. So this was an old system I had that I wanted to use the bracket for, so I just disassembled this system. I almost used this system to start with, but I liked the idea of the clear canisters so I could see what was going on in my filters. So this system's actually ran with the 2 in line and then the 1 separate, which is exactly what I'm going to do with this bracket with my cartridges. I removed the hanging bracket off of the DI resin canisters, figured out what fittings I wanted to use on this new canister, pipe taped those, tightened those down. Then I went ahead and anchored the 2 DI resin canisters to that bracket that I took off the old system. I did have to drill 2 new holes so I could space that new canister away from the other 2 to make room for the new fittings. Then I used some of the screws out of the old canisters to anchor the new canister to that filter bracket. I used my drill to tighten these down so I can set the torque limit so I do not strip out the plastic housing. Here's a good view of how I spaced those apart so there's room for the fittings. So the nature of an RO membrane actually removes a lot of the alkalinity and turns the water very acidic, way too acidic for a saltwater system. So I only turn the system on once a week and fill my auto top-offs so I can adjust the pH on my water before it gets entered into my system. So that's another reason why this power strip comes in really handy. I've got a switch for my auto top-off. So while I'm filling my auto top-off, I shut that switch off, which does not allow it to pump any water into my system. I got my RO pump. I went ahead and turned my booster pump on. Once both of my auto top-offs are full, I shut down my system, shut off the water for the RO. Then I have a switch, which I haven't labeled yet, for this circulation pump. I turn that circulation pump on, adjust the pH on my auto top-off, let it circulate, make sure that pH is good. Then I go ahead and shut the circulation pump off and turn my auto top-off back on. So right before I was getting ready to post this video, guys, the pressure spiked on my RO system to almost 120 psi. Now I don't know whether the pressure regulator on that pump got stuck, but now it's working fine again. However, I am thinking about getting one of these safety switches to shut down the pump if that does happen again. All right, guys, so at first I'm going to go over the original system, how it came to me, and then how I modified it. So you got your supply water coming in, and it comes around through my pressure gauge, through my shutoff valve, through my TDS sensor in, goes through the sediment. Now I drew these out. The water flow is going to go around the outside of these cartridges and then out through the center. And that is the same for every cartridge in this system. So we're going through our sediment, through carbon block 1, through carbon block 2, coming out of carbon block 2, up and around to the flow valve, out of the flow valve into RO membrane. The good water coming out of the membrane is going to go through a check valve, through the flow valve, and down through the DI resin 1 and 2, out of the DI resin, through the out TDS meter, filtered water to my T. This is my water line going to my other auto top-off in my multiple systems, all running off one sump filtration, then through a shutoff valve and into my auto top-off. The wastewater out of the membrane is then coming around and going out through the flush valve and out to my drain that I have going to my front yard. So that's how that original system was ran. Now we'll get into how I modified the system. So on the modified system I did, I got my supply water coming in. It's going through a check valve, through my RO pump, through the pressure gauge, shutoff valve, TDS in, through my sediment, out of the sediment, around through carbon blocks 1, 2, and 3. This is my 0.5 micron. The carbon filters take out chloramines and stuff like that. I wanted to be extra cautious on, so I added that 0.5 micron. The one that came with it was a 1 micron, and the 0.5 microns are a little bit more money, so I figured if I leave the 1 micron on, maybe this one will last a little longer, is my thought process on that. Whether it's true or not, I'm not sure yet. Coming out of the carbon block, around through the flow valve, into the first RO membrane. The good water coming out of this membrane goes up to a Y valve. The bad water coming out of the first membrane goes around and goes into the second membrane, and the good water again comes out and goes to this Y valve. The bad water is coming out and going through the flush valve out to my drain in the front yard. Once the good water goes through this Y, through the check valve, through the flow valve, so we're coming out of the flow valve, through DI resin 1 and 2, out of the resin chambers, through the TDS out sensor, through my T, this is the one going to my multiple system, through the shutoff valve and my float for the auto top off. And once again, if I shut this valve off, it's going to force the water to go up to my other system to fill that auto top off first for whatever reason. Otherwise, this system is always going to fill first because it's going to take the path of least resistance before this shuts off and forces it up to my other system. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and it gave you some good information. If so, once again, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. My channel's got a wide variety of DIYs, all with the same intention: save you guys money by doing it yourselves. Hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.